Rainbow Push, Push Tech 2023.
And I'm glad that you're here. I'm even beyond glad to introduce our next panel. And let me just set the stage. Our focus will be on breaking barriers, creating new pathways of inclusion and leadership. This is really, really important and significant because it's basically the backbone of everything we're doing here and everything that Reverend Jesse Jackson initiated it. It's a focus. His objective always to break barriers that have held us back for years and years and years and blocked opportunities. He was needed. His leadership was needed, his voice to accomplish it during that period. And now we get to hear from two very special, incredible ladies who happen to be educators at the top of their game. Our two top universities in Northern California, both Stanford and Berkeley. That's them. Please welcome for me Stephany Baker, Assistant Vice President, Culture and Community at Stanford University. Yes, Stephany.
Thank you so much.
And Dr. Lisa Pruitt, Professor of Mechanical Engineering, the Lawrence Talbot Chair of Engineering at UC Berkeley.
Thank you. Thank you.
I am so honored that you both are here. You're comfortable and ready to display a lot of information. So ladies, make yourself at home, and we'll be following behind. We'll have questions and answers later. But ladies, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It is a great honor to be here.
Yes, absolutely.
We're going to talk about, as we just were so kindly introduced, about how we can break some barriers and how do we foster inclusive excellence. So we thought we'd start with story. How we got here, who we are. Because I think if we don't know who we are as ourselves, it's really hard to step out in this world. Yes. And Stephany's going to share some of her wisdom on inclusive excellence and some of her best practices. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I teach in personal leadership in engineering, about how we take care of ourselves. Because in order to take care of others, first, we have to take care of ourselves. I think when we think of great leaders, we know their stories. And their stories are not just perfect stories. They're often stories of adversity and challenge and overcoming barriers and difficulties. And I think to think we can create leadership and create leaders without that really misses a piece of what society needs. And I'm going to start with my story. And I recently published my story as a memoir, Soul of a Professor, memoir of an unengineered life, because I'm 30 years in at UC Berkeley. And I was one of the first women in engineering. And that has its own challenges, as you can imagine. But that wasn't the story I wanted to tell. The story I wanted to tell was that I had spent decades engineering a facade. I needed to fit in. I needed to be a part of something. And my specialty is engineering materials. And so I remember being an undergrad sitting in a metallurgy class, and we were talking about crystal structures and defects, and how defects could be used as strengthening mechanisms. And I thought, oh, I like that. Maybe I'm just a complex alloy. And my inner defects, maybe I can just wield them to be a strengthening mechanism. And while there were the usual things that I think are challenging, I think for me, the biggest challenge was that I struggled inside. I didn't feel like I belonged, and that wasn't necessarily linked to engineering. That was just a struggle that I had carried from childhood. I didn't know how to cope, and so I created these toolboxes to cope in this world. And not all of those toolboxes were very healthy. But to the outside world, I was going to have it together. And that meant academia was the perfect place to hide, because I could enrich myself in academics and research to the almost exclusion of every other part of my life. And so I didn't show up for personal relationship. I didn't show up for friendship. I didn't show up really for anything but research in the laboratory. And behind all of that, I wasn't really sure where I belonged, but I knew if I kept maybe seeking out these academic accolades, somehow I'd find worthiness. And so to my students, and I think this is really important and part of what inspired me to share story, was they only saw the perfect professor. They only saw a young, brilliant woman step into the room and teach classes. And so I was a mentor, I was an advocate, very much a voice of equity and inclusion and belonging, but at the same time, I was hiding these inner flaws. And those inner flaws were deeply embarrassing to me because I had struggled with addiction and I had struggled with an eating disorder, and they were long-lasting challenges. And so I tried to really put them deep within. So those are the flaws that I wanted to bury behind all of that engineered armor. But there's another rule in engineering materials, and that is that strength comes at the expense of ductility, and that eventually flaws, when overloaded, will cause you to come crumbling down. And so 12 years after my PhD, the same year, I went to the White House to receive the Presidential Award for Mentoring in Math and Sciences and Engineering. I hit such a personal low that I really wasn't sure I wanted to keep going. And that personal low happened all behind the scenes. So none of my students, none of my colleagues knew I was in struggle. I just kept it all hidden. But this horse on the cover of my book, his name is JJ Luck. I brought him into my life as a gift to myself after tenure. I thought he would be my event horse. In hindsight, I realized he was a gift, a spirit gift, a gift of bringing me personal challenge and insight, and that being brought me more than any academic education could have ever offered. And he brought me on this journey of natural horsemanship and equine guided leadership, and I started bringing my students out to work aside me with the horse, like the engineering students next to a horse, trying to work on personal growth. And so I got myself sober, I got myself in recovery, and again, never shared the story. So I grew up in front of thousands of students, and I never once shared my struggle. And I thought, well, why do they need to know? Like, why share that? Because the door started knocking, and students would come in, and they would either say, Professor Pruitt or Dr. Lisa, can I share something with you? I'm struggling. I'm struggling with anxiety. I'm struggling with depression. I'm struggling with addiction. I'm struggling with a sick family member. I'm struggling with an eating disorder. And they had nowhere to go. And how they knew to knock on my door, I don't know. But I knew that I knew their plight. And so at some point, I bravely decided I was just going to share it openly so that they could see that part of equity and inclusion and belonging is to take care of ourselves and to embrace our well-being and mental health. And so that's been a part of my journey, and part of how I know Stephany is through leadership. And I want to pass the baton to you and your story.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you.
So my story began back in February 2000. My brother, I got a call while I was in one of my courses in college, and it was a call from the Sheriff's Department for Santa Clara County. And what they said to me was, we have a gentleman here in the coroner's office, and we've just taken his fingerprints, and he matches your brother. I worked for law enforcement at that time. And so imagine going to the coroner's office, having to identify your brother's body. He was 25 years old. And if that was not enough, to find out that the way he died, he was shot 12 times by the police. They shot him, and then they realized that he was the wrong person. That was in February 2000. And so when George Floyd passed away in 2020, 20 years later, it was a reminder to me of how far we still have to go. And so from that experience, I started to really want to do more in the community. My brother has had two young girls, a 3-month-old, him and his wife, and a 5-year-old at the time that he was killed. My father is a Baptist preacher. Actually, that's how I met Dr. Bryant when I was about 9 years old in Santa Cruz. My father was pastoring, and he was at UCSC. My brother was involved in the deacons ministry and a singer at the church, so he wasn't in a gang. He wasn't out there selling drugs. He was a deacon at the church in ministry with our father. And so as I began to get older and I started seeing situations like this continuously happening in our world, I decided that I wanted to do more. So I left law enforcement, ended up in higher education. And so using the platform of education to really help individuals learn more about what it means to be inclusive. What does it mean to say that I'm accepting of this race, or just really coming to this point where we start to look at each other as human beings. It was a reminder to me that we needed to just go back to the basics of human kindness. And if we could just start there, there were opportunities for us to perhaps begin to transform our society. And so I began engaging in a lot of community activities. I am a proud member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And through that sorority, I've had the opportunity to engage in a lot of events and activities that have really gone into high schools and started talking to young people about what it means to pursue the things that they really want to do, not what someone has told them. In education, you know, we encounter a lot of students whose parents have told them, this is what you need to major in. If you're a parent out there doing that, let's stop doing that. But really having the opportunity to talk to young people about what's important to you. You know, what are your passions? What are your values? And then major in that thing. And so having the opportunity both through the sorority and through working at a university, I've been able to impact the next generation in that way. And then in the faith and compassion area, I'm also a minister. And so using that platform to not only declare the gospel of Jesus Christ, but to also encourage people to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion through the lens of everyone, that it's not a color thing. It's not a race or society thing, but really looking at the fact that if we have forgotten the mere basics of saying good morning and hello, you know, going back to those Southern values, until we can get back there, I don't believe that we will ever be able to truly transform our communities into a place where everyone feels like they belong. So, yeah. And so with that, the Center for Creative Leadership has defined inclusive leadership in this way, that inclusive leaders are individuals who are aware of their own bias and actively seek out and consider different perspectives to inform their decision-making and collaborate more effectively with others. The reason why, of course, because we're educators, making sure that we use this opportunity to just educate on this subject, people are defining inclusive leaders so differently nowadays. And so once we can at least get to a point of agreement of what inclusion is, what diversity is, that creates an opportunity for us to move forward together. When you have people defining these terms differently, we can't move forward in that way. So education in our communities, education in our companies are so important. The training and learning departments, human resources can't do that by themselves. My position is not housed within human resources at Stanford. I am my own office, and the reason being is because there are things that we have to tackle from a DEIB space that HR cannot be involved in, not because they are not equipped, it's because their job is often to protect the organization. And so when human resources has that responsibility, it is important to have these CDOs and individuals within your organization who are looking out for the people. And so defining inclusive leadership in that way is so important. And so inclusive workplaces, you know, a lot of times we look at surface diversity. Those are the things that we can see. But through my course, Creating Inclusive Leadership, and Creating an Inclusive Leader, we talk about what inclusion really is. And so I wanted to provide this slide because it talks about family status, background, age, disability, education, gender, and perspectives. So when people are talking about putting together an inclusive organization, an inclusive team, these are other components that should be taken into consideration, because we now know through DEIB research that the more diverse your teams are, the more competitive advantage you have over other organizations. And so really understanding the makeup of an inclusive workplace is key to being able to sustain yourself in the future. And so this slide here represents ways that we want to redefine culture, how we're redefining DEIB, both at an academic level and within the community, when we start to acknowledge the fact that DEIB is under attack. When we look at the media, as Cynthia was saying earlier, it is undeniable that people have a problem with this movement. So we cannot sit and act like that is not a reality. We have to think about ways that we can incorporate DEIB practices into the work that we're doing so that it is institutionalized. We don't have to walk around calling out DEIB in every meeting. But what we should be thinking about is, what is it that DEIB is supposed to accomplish, and have those type of conversations, especially with the individuals that are not necessarily in agreement with this initiative. And so this model is called the People-Centric Organizational Cultural Model that I created back in 2020 that is now being implemented in a couple of offices at Stanford. And it really, to me, it talks about everyone, but the principles that are embedded in this model is with the hopes of giving people of color, people that have not had access in the past, an opportunity to be included in those conversations where they would typically be absent. So when we talk about everyone matters, it's more than just titles. You know, it's being able to see people as people, and everyone deserving the opportunity to excel, everyone being given the opportunity to serve. Because we know that when you serve, that gives you exposure to leadership. And so creating space for everyone to do that. And then everyone is receiving. Everyone's getting those opportunities for appreciation, opportunities to receive recognition and rewards. And then the organization itself is also receiving the talent of the individual. And so this model helps us to think about all stakeholders in this inclusive workplace. And then most of all, everyone achieves. The organization is able to meet its mission because the organization was intentional in creating space for the diversity within it to be exposed and to be implemented and leveraged. And so this is the people-centered culture model.
Thank you. So one of the things we wanted to bring out to the audience was, what are your barriers to inclusive leadership? And we have just a few starting points. It might show up with unconscious bias. Stephany and I were having a conversation the other week, and I said, I think unconscious bias is actually more dangerous than conscious bias. Because in our culture, when we don't realize we have a problem, it's really hard to make change. And so I think this probably permeates in lots of different places, and it certainly still lives in the academic culture and the tech world. But I think sometimes we don't realize that we carry these biases. And in that sense, they're far more dangerous than the conscious ones. And so I think that one's a really important piece. Something else that Stephany and I were speaking about is psychological safety. And that's a piece of what I do in the leadership courses that I teach, is to try to create safe space for which we can explore ourselves and understand that really our stories, my story is your story is my story. They're not going to map directly, but so much of our experiences are to be shared. But we need to be safe to do so. And I think oftentimes, and especially in tech, where everything's meant to be perfect, the idea that you talk about weakness or flaw or challenges at home or challenges in life, it's a really difficult conversation to have. And so I think the absence of psychological safety is really a big challenge to inclusive leadership. Personal alignment with mission and values. I think when we have values as people, it's really important to make sure that we are aligned with the companies that we work with, the institutions that we work with, and that disconnect can be another place where we don't feel authentic. We don't feel like we get to bring our true selves to work. And I think that's another place for which we lose inclusivity and we lose excellence. Because when we don't feel aligned with ourselves, it's hard to bring our best self forward. And I think some of the structure that exists in academic institutions, technical vehicles, whatever our framework is, it's so important to have that support. So that's something to think about. Maybe we'll come back to that when we have our open discussion. What are your barriers? Maybe at home, maybe in community, and maybe at work. A piece of what I do in leadership for the students is, I think, something that's useful for all of us. And that is, the part of leadership is taking care of self. And that was a hard lesson for me to learn, because I worked myself to the point of exhaustion, and I'm sure that resonates for many people in here, where we lose ourselves. And so we can lose ourselves in many different ways, but one way is that we don't manage our time. And I say that intentionally. One of the things that is useful to think about is, no matter our resources, we still only get 7 days a week and 24 hours in a day. And oftentimes, the lack of saying no to someone else when they ask something of us is that we tend to say no to something that is actually quite important to us. And that might be our self-care, it might be sleep, it might be family. And so that inability to have boundaries, that inability to say how I intentionally want to set my day, can be really important to us as individuals, but also in how we get to show up at work, in community, in life. And one of the exercises we do in class is we talk about rocks and pebbles and sand. And we get a container, and that container represents your day. And it doesn't matter what you do with that container, it doesn't budge. And so that container is your 24 hours. And then you decide how you want to fill it. The rocks are meant to be those things that really align you. Maybe things that I intentionally want to have. Maybe it's spirituality. Maybe it's health, family. It's some aspect of who you are at the core. And that needs to have space in your day and space in your life. And so it's a rock. And then we can have pebbles, the things that move us along in the right direction. And then there's sand, the things that take up your time, but maybe don't move you forward. For me, that's email, just an immense amount of email. And so the problem is if I put too much sand in my container first, just energetically speaking, I'm depleted already. And I also don't have time for those rocks. And so I might try to wedge a rock in, but maybe it doesn't fit. Tomorrow I'll get the rock in. And so one of the things we do is we start to think about what those rocks represent. And so I always encourage students, think about what would be the word that would be on your rock. Maybe put that somewhere where you can see it. And make sure that in your day and in your week and in your month that those rocks are there. And so we're intentional about how we take control of our time and our energy and how we take care of selves. And so I think that's something that I had to learn the difficult way, which is to take care of self is in fact a rock, and that our mental health and well-being is in fact a rock. And so that's a piece of that. And the other is an energetic balance, and that is, are we working in our genius zones? Are we working in flow? Or are we doing things that someone else could do this job and maybe even do it better? And it's not bringing out the best part of me. And one of the things that we explore in that is that sometimes we go through our trainings, I teach engineers, so we get skills in engineering and we get our job, and then we get promoted right out of our excellent zone into incompetent zone. And so we've heard a lot of that on the stage today, where sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And the next thing we know is we're in charge of programs, but we don't actually have the tools to implement them appropriately. And so part of that can be energy, like I don't have the skill sets here. And it also can be, I'm not aligned with the missions and goals of this work anymore. I think in working with Stephany, when we've had the opportunity to do leadership workshop, like for me, that feels like zone of genius. It feels like we get to do something that puts us in energetic flow. It doesn't feel like work. It just feels like things that I'm aligned with that are part of what I want to bring into young people's lives, academic culture, and try to make a difference in a positive way.
Would you please give them a big...
Thank you.